Have you ever noticed how, during insomnia, in the dark, your mind does not just remember a conversation, it replays it? Not for nostalgia, but for inspection. You hear your own voice, their tone, the pause you wish you had filled, the sentence you wish you had shaped differently. The room is quiet, but your head feels busy, like it is trying to finish something that never got finished. If you do this, it probably is not because you are dramatic or fragile. It is often because you carry a kind of perfectionism that does not look like perfectionism. It does not show up as spotless counters or color-coded calendars. It shows up as an internal standard that keeps moving, and a private fear that a small social moment can reveal something permanent about you. Tonight, we are going to walk through that hidden mechanism, how it forms, why it gets louder at night, and how it can quietly shape your relationships, your identity, and even your sleep. And while you listen, it is worth asking yourself a simple question. When you replay the past like this, what are you trying to protect? At night, the brain changes its priorities. With fewer sights and sounds to process, the mind turns inward. Neuroscientists often connect this to the brain's default mode network, the system linked to self-reflection, memory, and the stories we build about who we are. That can be a space for insight, but if your inner world is trained to scan for mistakes, the darkness becomes a microscope. A neutral phrase starts to feel suspicious. A delayed reply starts to feel loaded. A mild, awkward moment starts to feel like evidence that something about you is not quite right. Insomnia can intensify it, not just because you have time to think, but because your nervous system is running in a strange, in-between state. You are not fully awake in the bright daytime way, and you are not asleep either. Your body is tired, but your mind is alert, as if rest requires permission it cannot quite receive. In sleep research, this is sometimes described as hyperarousal, a body that stays prepared even when there is nothing to fight. The bed becomes a place where control is supposed to loosen, and it refuses. Sleep loss makes it worse in a very specific way. Researchers like Matthew Walker have described how a tired brain becomes less able to regulate emotion, with systems that detect threat becoming more reactive and systems that keep perspective becoming less steady. So what felt slightly uncomfortable in the afternoon can feel humiliating at 2 a.m. Your mind does not just replay the conversation, it upgrades it into a warning, and your body responds as if something is happening now, and you might feel it physically. A tight throat when you remember a sentence, a small heat in your face when you picture how you looked, a pulse that will not slow down when you imagine what they might have meant. That is part of what makes nighttime rumination so convincing. It does not stay in the head, it moves into the body, and the body has its own logic. The body does not argue, it reacts. That is where hidden perfectionism lives. Not in public performance, but in private review. You go back through a moment again and again, trying to locate the exact point where you slipped. Maybe you spoke too fast. Maybe you were too quiet. Maybe you laughed at the wrong time. Maybe you said something honest and immediately regretted it. The mind acts like a careful editor, but the emotional tone gives it away. This is not curiosity. It is self-surveillance. It is the feeling that the moment is not over until you have extracted a verdict. In clinical psychology, there's a pattern often discussed in social anxiety research called post-event processing. After an interaction, the mind keeps analyzing what happened, especially what might have gone wrong. Cognitive models associated with researchers like Clark and Wells describe how attention turns inward, how you begin monitoring yourself while the interaction is still happening, and how the mind later reviews it through a biased lens. It is not a neutral memory. It is an imagined viewpoint. You picture how you looked from the outside, what your expression meant, what your silence implied, what they must have thought. And in that imagined viewpoint, there's usually a judge. The judge is rarely satisfied, because the standard is not simply to be understood. It is to be unmisunderstood. Not simply to be liked, but to be liked without risk. Not simply to be respected, but to be respected without ambiguity. Human relationships cannot offer that kind of certainty. So the perfectionistic mind keeps working after the moment ends, trying to do the impossible retroactively. A lot of people tell themselves they are just learning, preparing, becoming better. But preparation has a destination. The truth is, the moment is already gone. What you're really trying to prepare for is the feeling you do not want to have again. That tightening in the chest when you imagine someone judging you. That heat in the face when you picture yourself looking foolish. That quiet dread that you are seen in a way you cannot correct. The review is not about the facts. It is about preventing shame. For many people, this does not start as ambition. It starts as safety. If you grew up in an environment where approval was conditional, where mistakes were punished, mocked, or remembered, your nervous system may have learned a simple rule: be careful, and you will suffer less. Attachment researchers like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth described how early relationships shape the internal models we carry into adulthood, the expectations we develop about closeness, acceptance, and rejection. In a home where emotions were unpredictable, the child learns to scan, to read tone, to anticipate, to stay one step ahead. Perfectionism, in that context, is not vanity, it is strategy. So you become someone who calibrates, someone who reads the room, someone who keeps things smooth. You may even be described as composed, thoughtful, easy to talk to. But inside there is a constant adjustment, because being just right is how you keep the air safe. You do not only want connection, you want connection without the possibility of being punished for being human. And when the conversation ends, the mind reviews the calibration, because review feels like control. Hidden perfectionism often hides behind good qualities. People confuse it with self-awareness. They call it depth, and sometimes it is. But when it is driven by fear, it comes with a specific kind of exhaustion. You are not just living. You are managing how you are seen while you live. You are present, but also watching yourself being present. You are speaking, but also evaluating your tone as you speak. You are listening, but also checking whether you look engaged enough. It is like living with a second set of eyes inside your head, eyes that never blink. Then the lights go out, and the observer gets louder. Memory does not help you here, because memory is not a recording. It is reconstructive. Psychologists have described how each recall is a rebuild, shaped by mood, expectation, and meaning. Each time you revisit an event, you rebuild it using your current fear and your current fatigue. That is why the same conversation can feel worse each time you replay it. Not because the past is changing, but because your nervous system is. The words blur, but the feeling stays sharp, because emotional learning does not need perfect detail to keep you on alert. This is also where cognitive distortions creep in quietly. The mind reads faces like verdicts. It assumes it knows what someone meant. It leaps from a small awkward moment to a larger conclusion. In cognitive therapy, associated with figures like Aaron Beck, those patterns have names: mind reading, catastrophizing, hindsight bias, but at night they rarely feel like distortions. They feel like clarity. Darkness has a way of making one story feel inevitable. You might notice how quickly the story becomes moral. You did not just sound uncertain. You were weak. You did not just hesitate. You were incompetent. You did not just express a need. You were too much. That is a hidden standard revealing itself. The belief that normal human traits are failures. The belief that emotions are defects. The belief that being affected by life is something you should outgrow. This is one of the most private forms of perfectionism, not the desire to be flawless on paper, but the desire to be flawless inside. You do not just criticize what you said, you criticize what you felt. If you felt anxious, you judge yourself for being anxious. If you felt hurt, you judge yourself for being hurt. If you felt angry, you judge yourself for not being above it. The mind demands an impossible kind of inner control, and then punishes you for not having it. And then there is identity, the deeper layer that does not sound like anxiety at all. Hidden perfectionism often carries a fear of being exposed as inadequate, not in a dramatic public way, but in subtle moments, being seen as less competent than you appear, less stable, less impressive, less in control. You can live a whole life trying to prevent that exposure, even while telling yourself you are simply being responsible. You can hear it in the inner critic's language. It rarely says you could do better next time. It says, "What were you thinking?" It speaks in absolutes because absolutes feel safer than nuance. It treats social life like a test with correct answers, because the alternative is accepting that human connection is messy, interpretive, and partly uncontrollable. Harshness becomes a kind of false honesty, as if cruelty is the price of being realistic. But realism does not usually sound like contempt. Realism can be accurate and still humane. The critic is often something else, a guardian. A part of you convinced that if it relaxes, you will be blindsided. That if it stops scanning, you will miss the moment someone turns away. That if it stops correcting, you will become careless and pay for it. In that sense, the critic is not only judging you. It is trying to keep you from shame, because shame feels like a threat to belonging. Belonging is not a small thing. The brain treats it as safety. Researchers studying rejection sensitivity and social pain have shown how the body can respond to perceived exclusion with real stress responses. So when you replay a conversation and fear you sounded wrong, you are not only chasing polish, you are chasing relief. You are trying to reassure the part of you that believes one imperfect moment could cost you closeness. This is why the replays often attach themselves to high-stake people, a supervisor, a parent, a partner, a friend whose approval feels powerful, or even a stranger whose opinion should not matter but does because it touches an old nerve. The mind treats those interactions as dangerous because it is not only evaluating the interaction, it is evaluating the possibility of losing a place in someone else's mind. And there is a particular kind of loneliness in that. Because on the outside, you might look fine. You might even look confident. But inside, you are living with a constant sense of audition. You might keep your feelings contained so they cannot be used against you. You might keep your opinions soft so they cannot spark conflict. You might over-explain so no one can accuse you of having the wrong intent. You might apologize automatically, not because you are guilty, but because smoothing the air feels like survival. This is another hidden sign, the feeling that you are responsible for the emotional climate of the room. If someone is uncomfortable, you search for what you did. If someone is quiet, you assume you caused it. If someone is distant, you start writing the story before you have the facts. That can come from empathy, yes, but it can also come from old conditioning. In homes where mood swings were dangerous, children learned to monitor the atmosphere. They learned that reading the room is not a social skill, it is a survival skill. So as an adult, you might feel pressure to manage other people's feelings. You become the one who keeps peace, the one who makes things easy, the one who says the right thing, the one who never wants to be a burden. And that sounds admirable until you notice what it costs you at night, when your mind keeps scanning for the moment you might have failed in that role. The mind will insist it is simply trying to fix things. It will say if you find the mistake, you can prevent it next time. But what it wants is certainty. It wants to know, with absolute clarity, how you were seen and what it meant. It wants to remove ambiguity because ambiguity feels like vulnerability. And if you have learned that vulnerability can be punished, your brain will treat ambiguity like a threat. That is how the loop feeds itself. The more you replay, the more attention you train onto perceived flaws. The more attention you train, the more important those flaws feel. The more important they feel, the more your nervous system treats future interactions as high risk, which makes you monitor more, which creates more material for replay. It is a closed circuit that can look like insight from the outside, while feeling like captivity from the inside. You might recognize the same circuit in how you text. A simple message can take 10 minutes because you are rewriting it, not to be clear, but to be safe. You remove anything that could sound needy. You add anything that could sound warm. You keep adjusting until it feels neutral enough that no one can accuse you of wanting too much. And even then, after you send it, your body stays slightly braced, waiting for the response and for what it might mean. You might recognize it in how hard it is to let a good moment be simply good. Someone compliments you, and your mind searches for what they did not see. An interaction goes well, and part of you waits for the correction. If your nervous system learned that relief is temporary, success does not settle you. It keeps you vigilant because connection feels like something you have to maintain perfectly to keep. Sometimes the most painful part is that you know intellectually that you are overthinking. You can name it, you can see the pattern. And still, at night, it returns. That is because this is not only a thought habit, it is a nervous system habit. Logic does not always calm what was learned through emotion. The body learns through repetition, and it will keep repeating what once kept you safe, even when the world has changed. There is also a quieter truth the perfectionistic mind rarely admits. The replays are not only about fear, they are also about longing. A longing to be understood cleanly, a longing to be seen without being evaluated, a longing to speak and not pay for it later, a longing for connection that does not require constant management. If you replay conversations, it might be because you care deeply about how you land, not because you want control for its own sake, but because being misread has hurt you before, and you never want to feel that kind of helplessness again. Underneath all of this are two needs that do not always agree: the need to be seen and the need to stay protected from being seen too clearly. Perfectionism offers a compromise. Be visible, but only in a controlled way. Be close, but only if you can manage the impression. And when you cannot, the mind retreats into review, trying to regain control after the fact. The irony is that control never becomes security. Control becomes labor. It becomes an endless job you cannot quit because your brain has linked it to safety. The moment you stop working, you feel exposed. And the mind interprets that exposure as danger. So it returns to the conversation again and again, like a hand going back to check whether a door is locked. If you recognize yourself here, it does not mean you are broken. Often, it means you are intensely aware. You notice detail. You care about impact. You have a nervous system that learned to associate small mistakes with real emotional consequences. And it makes sense that a system built for protection would get louder in the dark when there is nothing else to hold on to. Your mind is trying to keep you safe using the only language it trusts: perfection. And sometimes, beneath all the analysis, there's a quieter grief, the sense that your real self only gets to exist when it is edited, that you have to earn softness by being exceptional and earn acceptance by being easy to digest. The night exposes that bargain, because in the dark, you cannot distract yourself with achievement. You are left with the simple question of whether you can be ordinary and still be held. And if it hurts, it matters. This is human too. So the question is not only why do I do this? The question is, what kind of safety am I trying to earn through perfection? Because the replay is rarely about the conversation itself. It is about the feeling of uncertainty the conversation leaves behind, the feeling of not being fully in control of how you were seen, the feeling that being misread could cost you something. There is a quiet shift that can happen when you start to see the pattern clearly. The darkness stops being proof that something is wrong with you and starts to look like evidence of something working too hard inside you. Not evil, not weak, just overtrained. A mind that learned it had to be vigilant to stay safe, and if this felt familiar, there is something else worth noticing. You're not the only person who lives with this kind of late-night courtroom. There's a quiet community of minds that replay, revise, and rehearse because they care deeply and fear deeply at the same time. The loneliness often comes from believing nobody else hears their own thoughts this loudly, but many do. Some of them are awake right now in rooms that look like yours, carrying the same private standard and the same private doubt. Sometimes it helps to imagine that community, not as a crowd, but as a handful of people scattered across the night, each one learning the same lesson in their own way. That being careful is not the same as being safe, and that a mind can be intelligent, sensitive, and still exhausted by its own standards. You do not have to turn this into a performance. You do not have to prove your worth in your head at 2 a.m. You only have to notice what the mind is doing and what it is trying to protect. You do not have to force the mind to stop thinking to understand it. Sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is notice what it is protecting and what it is afraid would happen if it ever stopped. Because beneath the edits and the replays, the core question is not how do I say it perfectly. It is, am I allowed to be imperfect and still belong?